Hello and a very warm welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Sanam Shantier. Coming up on this week's programme, remembering Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, who's still a polarising figure 50 years after his death. Plus, Iraq's vulnerable media landscape. Journalists covering anti-government protests face death threats and violence, while some are being detained. We'll be hearing the testimony of award-winning Iraqi Kurdish journalist Hiwa Osman. But first, to a wrap of the top stories in the region this week. Another lockdown in Israel, Lebanon's ongoing political crisis, and the second intifada 20 years on.
Breaking the quiet, a loudspeaker announces the start of Yom Kippur. Although the holiest day in the Jewish calendar brings Israel to a standstill each year, the synagogues are usually packed. This time, though, authorities ordered that prayers be held in small, socially distanced groups outdoors.
Everyone goes to the synagogue, or now at times it's not so easy, so we pray outside, but we all getting ready to pray to God. God is our Father, and we're asking God He should give us a good and sweet year.
Israel entered its second lockdown on the 18th of September after a surge of new cases. The country of 9 million people has seen around 1,500 deaths from the virus.
J'ai honte. J'ai honte pour vos dirigeants. J'ai honte pour eux.
The French president says Lebanon's political leaders have betrayed him. In the wake of a devastating explosion in Beirut's port 2 months ago, Emmanuel Macron laid out a plan for a new Lebanese cabinet to make reforms and fight corruption, in exchange for international aid which would save the country from economic collapse. It wasn't to be. After a political dispute, Lebanon's Prime Minister-designate stepped down on Saturday without naming a cabinet. Despite this, Macron is clinging to his proposed roadmap to break the stalemate. He says he won't impose sanctions for now. The cry of intifada, uprising, goes up from a rally in Ramallah. They're marking 2 decades since the start of the second intifada, 5 years of intense violence in which more than 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis were killed. For Fatah, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, the second intifada will not have been the last.
We will continue our resistance against the Israeli occupation, against the settlers, against American arrogance, and against anyone who tries to normalize relations with Israel, thinking that they can undermine the determination of this people.
During the second intifada, Israel built the West Bank barrier, saying it was needed to prevent attacks. To this day, though, Palestinians see it as an annexation of their land.
This week marks 1 year since hundreds of thousands took to the streets of Iraq to call for the removal of the country's ruling elite. The deadly demonstrations led to the resignation of then Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi. He was succeeded by Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who pledged to integrate protesters' demands into his policies, but in reality achieved very little of that. Now today, it's not just the protest movement that's under threat. Some media outlets have been shut down, while a number of journalists have been detained or even received death threats. Now on today's show, we're joined by someone who very sadly has experienced all of this firsthand. I'd like to welcome Hiwa Osman to the programme, who joins us from Erbil. Hiwa, thank you so much for speaking to us on Middle East Matters.
You're welcome.
Can you talk us through your own experience of working as a journalist in Baghdad, covering those protests?
Well, last year, when the protests started, on day one, we heard of some government repression of the protests and them banning the media from going there. So I heard about the news and I wanted to make sure firsthand. So I went there with my mobile. Went with my mobile to the area with a friend who's also a camera person, and he's a journalist. We went to the Tahrir Square area, and we saw how the government how the security forces that were there were trying to push the protesters with tear gas, with live bullets. Nobody knew what kind of tear gas was being used. For a while it was CS, then it was a gas that induces paralysis to the protesters. It's the type of gas used on terrorists, not on protesters. So we were subjected to the tear gas and everything, but we managed to film some of the reactions, some of the interviews with the people who were on the streets. And a few days later, and we broadcast all of that on social media, various social media platforms, after them banning the internet or cutting the internet. The government cut the internet on day 2 or 3. Then we started receiving death threats. At one point, a very senior government official called me. He said, "Leave Baghdad because they are targeting you." And me and many other colleagues of mine who are in the profession, we had to flee the city and go to other parts of the country. And the general rule is that you go to Kurdistan in Iraq because it's safer. And the authorities in Baghdad cannot reach you. And now Erbil is full of journalists, protesters from the south, from the center and the south of the country, who have fled the repression of the militias, of the security forces, and of those pro-Iranian militias, namely.
And of course, what these protests have also done is really polarized the media landscape in Iraq.
They have. The media after that. You know, in Iraq, there is a strong Iranian influence. And the same thing is reflected in the media. The media that's trying to be objective, impartial, and report the news, and sometimes as pro-protesters, is seen as stooges of the American embassy. They call them, "You are the jokers of the American embassy," in reference to the film Joker that was out last year around the same time as the protests. There is the other media camp that is pro-Iranian, and they are members of the Union of Islamic Radios and TVs. They are being funded by them, and they speak against the protesters, and they accuse all the protesters of being stooges and agents of the Americans and the Zionists, and the usual rhetoric that's used by Iran generally. So the media was extremely polarized, and at the same time, the pro-government side of the militias, or the pro-Iranian militias, attacked on the eve of the 5th or the 6th of October. I can't exactly remember, but I remember tweeting about it back then. They attacked about 7 radio and TV stations in Baghdad. They burned down some of them. They arrested some of the workers who were in the stations. And they managed to close them down in an effort to prevent the reporting of these TVs of the protests. But what they didn't realize that everyone has a mobile phone and social media, and the protests were still being reported.
And Hiwa, can you tell us, lastly and very briefly, where we stand today?
Today, this week, we are marking the first anniversary of the protests. And many people will take to the streets to mark the anniversary in demanding their rights and demanding that the killers of the 700 to 800 protesters be brought to justice. But what is expected also is for members of the anti-government or pro-Iranian elements who last year killed the protesters pose as protesters this year and get into the protest. This will be an attempt to change the characteristics of the popular protests in Iraq, and the media will have to see which side they have to take on, or it will be still under a grave challenge of reporting the objective story from Iraq.
And of course, your fight goes on as the crackdown continues. Hiwa Osman, I'd like to thank you for speaking to us here on Middle East Matters. Now, it's been 50 years since the death of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the charismatic president of Egypt from 1954 to 1970. To this date, he inspires debate among Egyptians and the Arab world alike. For many, he was a liberation hero who took the country back from British control. Critics, however, saw him as a symbol of populist authoritarianism. Here's a report from our team on the ground. Claire Williot and Edouard Dropsy take a look at his legacy.
On the 1st of October 1970, the Arab world was in mourning. Gamal Abdel Nasser's funeral procession drew millions of Egyptians. Farida El-Shubashi still gets emotional looking back at these images. The journalist and author says that the father of modern Egypt can never be replaced.
Every Egyptian felt like they had lost their father, their son, their brother. We didn't love him because he had beautiful eyes. He did have beautiful eyes, but that isn't why we loved him. With him, we felt that we were safe. We had dignity. We felt we were all equal, and that was really important.
Nasser famously nationalised the Suez Canal in 1956. Before that, he had kicked the British colonisers out of Egypt. In the midst of the Cold War, he struck out against Western domination. His nationalist struggle for independence made him an icon. Booksellers in Cairo's Al-Azbakaya district continue to trade on his image.
Here people love Abdel Nasser, and they like to keep mementos of him, especially older people, less so the young.
But he wasn't perfect.
He did so much. He unified all the Arab countries. So of course, he made mistakes. He imprisoned and tortured people. So I think he had a good side, but also a bad one.
A social reformer and a despot, a civilian and a soldier, a triumphant Arab liberator turned loser during the Six-Day War. For this historian, Nasser was all of these things at once, an extraordinarily complex figure of 20th century history.
We can't separate between the two Nassers. He was an authoritarian nationalist, but the two sides must be considered. He was a nationalist and made reforms, but he wouldn't have been able to make them if he had not been authoritarian.
Caught between authoritarianism and attempts at social reform, today's Egypt has certain similarities with that of Nasser. In both contexts, voices of dissent are heavily suppressed.
Well, that's it from us this week. Thank you for watching.